What's up, Fluffle Gang? We are back, and today we're talking about the boss. The boss is the invisible trigger behind each Metal Gear game, as without her, we wouldn't have a bunch of well-meaning but misguided men trying to fulfill her will. Despite only being in one game, the boss shaped the series through her beliefs, and today we're going to go through exactly what those beliefs were and how they were shaped. The boss wished for a world united without borders, where political and economic struggles for power were meaningless. The foundation for this belief can be traced all the way back to her childhood, which makes sense since our environments shape us and the boss is no different. The earliest hint we get of this belief is with the boss's father, who was one of the founding members of the Wise Men's Committee, and shared with the boss the nature of this committee. The Wise Men's Committee formed following World War I, and the members were the most wealthy and powerful people from the United States, Russia, and China. The Wise Men's Committee pooled its resources and used their influence to steer the world away from war, striving to avoid another disastrous world war. They were globalists, secretly uniting some of the world's most powerful nations through their meetings and acting for the benefit of the entire world regardless of borders. Let's talk about globalization though for a minute. What is globalization? Globalization has three main facets: cultural, political, and economical convergence. Cultural convergence is the ideas and information of two cultures adapting and becoming similar to one another through frequent exposure. A great example of cultural convergence is when Eva exposes Naked Snake to instant ramen and wants to take him out for sushi. These two foods are one aspect of a culture Eva was exposed to and then proceeded to expose another person to it too. Major Zero's interest in movies exposes him to foreign films around the world, and as he leans more into this interest, the more familiar he becomes with the cultures represented. Mei Ling sharing Chinese proverbs with Solid Snake is another great example of cultural convergence, as she's sharing with him the wisdom from her culture and mixing it with his experiences to make them personally valuable to him. Political convergence refers to countries coming together politically through national policies. For example, NATO and the UN are organizations working to bring the world together politically through their policies. In MGS, the Wise Men's Committee works to politically unite the world by bringing together some of the most politically powerful and wealthy leaders from the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. We'll get more into the Wise Men's Committee in more detail later, but for now, know that what they did was an example of political globalization, despite their efforts being carried out in secret. Economical systems converging refers to when countries with lower levels of GDP, that's gross domestic product, or the value of the final goods and services produced in a country, catch up to countries with higher levels of GDP. So if country A has potential to produce $100 of GDP in a year and country B has the potential to produce $10 of GDP in that same year, but the next year country A produces $110 of GDP, because we're assuming all countries are growing, and country B produces $90 of GDP, that's economical convergence because country B is catching up. If that doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. The important thing to understand is that the belief behind economic convergence is that countries that produce lower levels of GDP have a higher growth rate than countries that produce higher levels of GDP, and that closing the gap is a good thing. These countries benefit from the advances the countries ahead of them have already made, and as they catch up, they can contribute to the systems already laid out and make them that much more robust. Globalization is the intertwining of political, cultural, and economic facets of nations and the growing of interdependence of nations. What does it mean to be a globalist? In short, you believe in cultural, political, and economic convergences for the benefit of all people involved, and that economic and foreign policy should be planned in support of these things, or at least with keeping these in mind. So the boss was raised with these fundamental beliefs that the world needed to work towards the benefit of all, regardless of borders, for if we work together, all of humanity benefits and progresses. The boss's father put his globalist beliefs into practice through the Wise Men's Committee. Unfortunately, she was also witness to the Wise Men's Committee's slow corruption as the succeeding generation failed to uphold the founders' beliefs and fractured as they used their powers and resources to instead push their personal agendas forward. The seceding members, the philosophers, assassinated the boss's dad to rid themselves of the last of the founding members and solidify their power. The philosophers funded schools to train operatives and become unquestioned forces behind their governments through espionage. As the philosophers involved themselves in wars globally, they became a war machine themselves, as their support in these conflicts would spark new wars in an endless cycle. Could you imagine watching your dad's life's work spiral into corruption like that? They go from wanting to prevent war to a focus on power and control and becoming a war machine themselves. This must have impacted the boss, as she didn't touch any of the philosopher's resources she had access to until she felt her back was against a wall years later. The president had assigned her a mission to place an agent within the Soviet Union to feed them information on their space technology, but the CIA wasn't in support of this mission, and so refused to lend the boss any of their resources. Dedicated to the mission, the boss used the philosopher's spy channels to accomplish what she'd been tasked to do. The specifics of this mission aren't important in regards to the boss's will, but what is important is the detail that the boss used any means necessary to accomplish her mission set out for her by the president despite detractors. This would become a pattern for her, as she always gave everything she had to her mission. Fast forward to the Manhattan Project, the boss was tasked with infiltrating Los Alamos, where the project was taking place, and assassinating John von Neumann, a Hungarian-born American and applied mathematician and polymath. John von Neumann was believed to be a Nazi spy, though this was misinformation spread by the Soviet Union to sabotage the Manhattan Project. This would be the first time the boss faltered, as she found out shortly before the mission she was pregnant. Despite her pregnancy, she attempted to carry out her mission, but was distracted during it. This resulted in her failure to assassinate John von Neumann, and despite finding out years later that he wasn't actually a Nazi spy, the boss felt that her failure had resulted in the Manhattan Project being a success, with the bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the world being plunged into the Cold War. So the one time the boss falters, the world is irrevocably damaged, and nations are that much more divided with a Cold War. After the Manhattan Project, the boss was tasked with the Mercury Project and was sent into space as a test subject on how the human body could cope under those conditions. It was here that her dream of seeing the world united as one was sparked, as she viewed the Earth from space as a celestial body without borders or nations. This shift in perspective is called the overview effect, and let's talk about it for a second. The overview effect is something that's really difficult for me to wrap my mind around as someone who's never left Earth. Frank White, a space philosopher, says that he doesn't want the overview effect to be seen as something out of reach or weird though. When interviewing Joe Allen, a shuttle astronaut, Joe told Frank traveling through space was an extension of his travels on Earth. It was heightened, more profound, but still an extension of something familiar. Frank explains that his own experience with the overview effect happened when he was flying across the country and imagining what it would be like to live in a permanent settlement floating in the space between Earth and the Moon, where you'd always have an overview of the Earth. So everyone has the potential to experience the overview effect under the right circumstances. I don't know if this is similar to the overview effect since I'm not an astronaut and I haven't been to space, but I live by the ocean. And there's nothing that breaks down borders more than standing on the shore and seeing a person out in a boat. Suddenly, it doesn't matter how different we are or our political beliefs. We're just both people experiencing life on this celestial body, and we both hope nothing but the best for one another. I don't know if this anecdote helps you, but hopefully it does. Have you ever experienced a moment like that, where suddenly you and the person you're observing are just people unified on this planet through activities or how you're experiencing life in that moment? I don't know. This is the best way I can try and describe the overview effect in a tangible way that hopefully gives you an idea of what perspective it can lend you, without needing to book a plane ride. The boss goes into space, experiences the overview effect, then comes back down to a world still divided by the Cold War. After recovering from her mission, she's tasked with confronting the Sorrow, her former lover and the father of her child, with only one of them able to walk away with their life, otherwise their child would be killed. The boss is thrust back into politics that pit nations against one another and her against the person she loves for the sake of their child, despite having just had the revelation that we're all on this planet together and should be working towards shared goals. She stays loyal to her mission though, and together she and the Sorrow decide she'll be the one to survive the encounter. Moving quickly through the events of MGS3 Snake Eater, the boss is tasked with being the US's patsy to ease Cold War tensions through the Soviet Union and the US. She sacrifices the unit she built from the ground up, the Cobra unit, for these means, along with her reputation, as she puts on a show of defecting from the US to effectively become their enemy and scapegoat. Ultimately, she's tasked with dying by the hand of her most recent trainee, Naked Snake. Despite this, she tells Snake at their final battle that if he fails to kill her, that she'd use the Philosopher's Legacy, funds pulled by the Philosophers, to reunite the Philosophers with a focus on their original goal to make the world one. The boss lived a life where she was repeatedly used as a pawn to fulfill the political needs of those in power, and she witnessed how that could hurt the ones she cared about firsthand with the Sorrow and Naked Snake and her Cobra unit. She was living in a divided world that her father had worked actively to try and unite. Her defeating Snake would mean that her mission to be a patsy for the United States had failed and that she wouldn't be able to return. So what better timing than to finally turn her attention to the newly blossomed beliefs she'd experienced during the Mercury Project and had been raised with by her father. I have no idea why the boss was loyal to the end to a government who used and betrayed her time and again and asked her to sacrifice her life and her name to them. Her father couldn't have been a nationalist, as he was clearly a globalist. The only thing I can think of is that maybe she was falling prey to the sunk cost fallacy, which is a phenomenon where a person is reluctant to abandon something because they've invested heavily in it, with either their time or resources, even when it's clear that abandonment would be more beneficial. You can see the sunk cost fallacy at work, even in your daily life, if you've ever seen people stay in the same line in the grocery store, even though a new line has opened up to take them. They've already waited in that line long enough so they stay in it. So maybe the boss had poured so much of her time and resources into the US that she wanted to see things through to the end, and her besting Naked Snake would be the first time she'd be truly ousted and forced to work for ideologies other than the ones of the leaders of her homeland. Regardless, the boss dreamed of a world where the politics of those in charge didn't pit people against one another and hurt the ones you loved. She dreamed of a world that was connected without borders and understood that by working towards the benefit of people, regardless of nationality or beliefs, that the whole of people would progress and benefit. She was raised with this belief by her father, who actively fought to be the change in the world he wanted to see, and was reminded of it when she participated in the Mercury project and viewed the Earth without borders from space. I hope this helps nail down the boss's will a little more clearly. She was a globalist who wanted people to come together and work towards a shared future. And that's all we have for the boss's will. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell, you know what to do. Most importantly, take care of yourselves, please. And I will catch you all in the next one. Thank you.